Up until this point, Usyk has done everything possible in boxing. He won an Olympic medal, which is what people sing Andre Ward praises for. As an amateur, he won over 300 fights and lost like around a dozen, which is something that people praise Lomachenko for. He's become undisputed in 2 separate weight classes, which is what people praise Crawford for. And he's remained undefeated, which is what every fighter gets praised for nowadays. So I think one of the most debated topics right now is Timothy Bradley and his opinions on Oleksandr Usyk. If you're not really into boxing, then you wouldn't recognize that name, but for those of you that are, you know that Oleksandr Usyk recently became a 2-time undisputed champion by beating Tyson Fury not once but twice. I think the criticism of Timothy Bradley is kind of crazy when you think about it, because Usyk probably had the most significant weight jump that could be done in boxing. But when you're fighting at cruiserweight, which is like the division he previously conquered, you know, you're fighting at the 200-pound limit. When you weigh in, you could probably weigh more than 200 pounds, but most fighters typically stay between like 200 to like 210. This current generation of heavyweights, they are extremely massive. They're like 6'9", for example, with Tyson Fury, or like Anthony Joshua, where they weigh in at like 240, 250, and they're just these giants. So Usyk came from a weight class where he's probably 40 to 60 pounds like lighter, and his reach and his height is a lot shorter than a lot of the different fighters that are fighting in the heavyweight division. And so he's clearly like facing the most disadvantages when it comes to his opposition. Timothy Bradley tried saying that Usyk's not an all-time great heavyweight or fighter because he only beat the 2 best heavyweights of his generation. But the problem with that is there's 2 things. It's like, one is Timothy Bradley was calling Tyson Fury, you know, an all-time great just last year. But since Usyk beat him, he kind of, you know, walked that comment back.
Tyson Fury can compete, I believe, in any era of the heavyweight division.
I guess the second issue with that would be that his like stablemate, like the person that he's a fan of, Terrence Crawford, he also became an undisputed champion in 2 weight classes, but I would say that Crawford's opposition at 140 was a lot less tough than the opposition Usyk faced. And Crawford essentially only had to fight 1 guy to become undisputed at welterweight. So we know he beat Jeff Horn. Again, this is a Jeff Horn that was coming off of a robbery win from Manny Pacquiao. So Crawford beat Jeff Horn to win the WBO belt. But up until that point, he waited maybe like 3-5 years to fight Spence, who had collected all the other belts. And so essentially, like, Timothy Bradley thinks that Crawford's an all-time great fighter, can go up and beat Canelo and all these things, but he really only beat 1 guy in Spence. And Spence, like, to say he was like damaged goods is kind of like an understatement. I guess full disclosure, I give Crawford all the credit in the world for that fight, but he fought a Spence that was coming off of like multiple car accidents. He fought a Spence that was out of the ring for I don't remember how many months. It might have been over a year. And it was a Spence that always had delays in his fights and never was really the same after the Sean Porter fight. He like partied way too much, got drunk way too often, and he just wasn't committed to the sport. And this is the fight that people praise Crawford for to like the highest degree, saying that he could beat and compete with anyone in any generation. And while it is like, you know, well deserved, that same criticism that Timothy Bradley is applying to Usyk could be applied to his favorite fighter in Crawford. The other thing is that Usyk fought all his fights on the road. He was a road warrior the entire time. He won all his cruiserweight belts in foreign soil. He went to all the champions' backyards and beat them for the most part. He's never been the favorite in any fight. You can just tell that he's like the promoter's worst nightmare because he's not a very marketable person. He doesn't speak the English language too well. There's that funny meme of him where after beating Anthony Joshua, he says, "I'm very feel."
I'm very feel.
And people ran with it, but you can tell he's not good at communicating in English. And so even when it comes to Turki Al-Sheikh, like, he's funding all the Usyk fights as of late, but he's always picked against the opposite fighter to win. The reason being is because the opposite fighters are typically more marketable and there's a lot more promotion behind them. So in an ideal world, we would have had Tyson Fury and Anthony Joshua fight both undefeated, or Anthony Joshua and Wilder fight both undefeated, but that's not the way it turned out. And then out of nowhere, this whole time we've been calling Anthony Joshua, Tyson Fury, and Deontay Wilder the three heavyweight kings of the last decade or so. And out of nowhere comes a small little cruiserweight. And I say small based on today's standards. He obviously would have been a pretty average to bigger size heavyweight if he was fighting back on the day. He just comes out of nowhere and does something that not a lot of people expected him to do. I mean, if you look at the odds for both of those fights, for the first Tyson Fury fight and for the first Anthony Joshua fight, they were extremely close. Like, Timothy Bradley tried to say that Usyk shouldn't be considered an all-time great because he only has 20-something fights. But he was also glazing over Lomachenko, and he had less than 20 and lost his 3 major fights. So lost his first title attempt against Salido, he lost a fight against Teofimo, and whether or not you think he won the Devin Haney fight, he also lost that one. And the same skill set that Lomachenko was showing, I think Usyk shows that to a higher degree, obviously, because he's, been undefeated this whole time. And I could also argue that Usyk has faced better competition than Lomachenko. So the fact that everyone over at ESPN calls Lomachenko an all-time great and not Usyk is kind of, it's kind of off-putting for me. Most importantly, with the exception of the Daniel Dubois fight, whether you want to call it a low blow or not, it was counted as such. And even if you give him that, he still went on to knock out Daniel Dubois off of a jab. Up until this point, Usyk has done everything possible in boxing. He won an Olympic medal, which is what people sing Andre Ward praises for. As an amateur, he won over 300 fights and lost around a dozen, which is something that people praise Lomachenko for. He's become undisputed in 2 separate weight classes, which is what people praise Crawford for. And he's remained undefeated, which is what every fighter gets praised for nowadays. So there's 4 different criteria that a lot of these fighters get praised for that apply to Usyk, and he's combined it all in one, yet Timothy Bradley doesn't think he's an all-time great fighter. Now, I could understand the argument of maybe saying he's not an all-time great heavyweight because he only had 7 fights at heavyweight. He started off fighting Witherspoon, then he fought Chisora, then he had the 2 Anthony Joshua fights, the Dubois fight, and then the Fury fights, but even then, his competition in that short run that he had was extremely competitive. I guess when we look back, we'll take into consideration the challenging road that Usyk had on the way to becoming the undisputed heavyweight. And for me personally, it's just, he's kind of like a Floyd Mayweather and a Manny Pacquiao, where it's I know that I'm watching something special and that I'm witnessing history kind of unfolding, if that makes sense. And so it's when you're watching when you were watching Kobe in his prime and you knew you were looking at something special. It's like that, you're looking at an all-time great fighter in his prime doing his thing against other competition that could potentially be labeled all-time great. I don't think Joshua could be labeled as all-time great. Personally, I think that Anthony Joshua had the best heavyweight resume besides Joseph Parker and Oleksandr Usyk. But for some reason, I wouldn't call Anthony Joshua an all-time great. He's, maybe a top 50, top 100 heavyweight. He did become a 2-time world champion, and, he collected and unified most of the belts. But for example, other than Klitschko and Wilder, Fury's resume is relatively weak. When it comes to Deontay, we all know that his 2 notable fights are Luis Ortiz and the losses to Tyson Fury. And so, in that sense, Wilder has all-time great power. Fury, a lot of people were calling him an all-time great. I thought that was kind of a stretch, but, Tim Bradley himself said that he's an all-time great, so we'll stick with that notion. And on top of that, Usyk beat Michael Hunter. He beat Breedis, who is obviously still giving the best cruiserweight Opataya challenges to this day. And so Usyk's resume has kind of aged, a lot better than so many other fighters. I don't know, dude. For me, it's I don't know. I feel special watching him fight because it's I rooted against him in the first Joshua fight, and I think that's when I learned my lesson. I remember the energy behind watching Usyk fight in that first Joshua fight, because we had just seen him struggle with Derek Chisora and we didn't think that he'd be able to compete with the top 3 heavyweights of this generation because of that fight. And there was this whole notion that, the heavyweights of today could dominate previous generations because of their sheer size and brute force. And Usyk just showed that that wasn't the case. And I think that's what I find the most impressive is that, hindsight, whatever, looking back at it, these were comments that were made, these were opinions that were had. Everyone thought that the heavyweights that we have today were great. And while they may not be great, I think that they were good. Because if we say that they're trash or that they're garbage, then essentially what you're doing is you're undermining Usyk's resume in that case as well. And I don't think that's fair either. I guess my question to Timothy Bradley would be, what else could Usyk do? He's a gold medalist, he's undefeated, he's unified and became undisputed in 2 separate weight classes. He's done it on the road, and other than the Dubois knockdown or knockout, there hasn't been much controversy in his career.